Okay, so we're going to get started with a final panel. So if you don't have time to ask questions, we can continue the conversation after with a drink. That usually helps. I also wanted to insist that some of the speakers that were on the program today have really, really amazing Twitter accounts. So if you liked some of the speakers, I would, and if you have a Twitter account, I would highly recommend that you start following them on their Twitter accounts. On that, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So hello everyone, I'm Sarah Ashbridge. I'm one of the research fellows at RUSI, and today we've got the final panel of the day, and we're going to talk about alliances, to build or to end. So we've mentioned alliances today in various contexts. We've talked to some of the pros, some of the cons, some things that are working and some that are not. But what do we do when alliances don't work? How can we leave them without major consequences for diplomatic relations? What do we do if a partnership proves to be no longer useful? And in the context of increased requirements for allied integration and interoperability, do our alliances that we currently engage in serve our needs? So our wonderful panel today are going to take us through some of these questions to explore what is theoretically and politically possible in this debate. So we'll go in the order of the agenda, and we will start with Lord Ricketts.
Right, and because I'm British, I have no microphone. On va essayer de corriger ça. Thank you very much, Sarah. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for having me. Even despite the microphone, I will try to have a few comments, but mostly to try and stimulate discussion, which is always, I think, the most interesting part. And it's great to be in Paris on an April day. L'ambassadeur d'Abbeville est sollicité. It's a very loud phone ring. Because I'm in Paris, I think I shall do something French, which is draw some distinctions. I think there are two important distinctions I'd like to draw at the start of our discussion. One is between established international organizations and ad hoc alliances and groupings. So, among the established organizations as I've lived and worked with and in, the United Nations, not fashionable to be positive about the UN these days, but its great attribute in the world of foreign policy and security is its universality. Yes, the Security Council is completely blocked when the great powers are at loggerheads, as now, but the UN General Assembly is the cockpit of the world for focusing global opinion, as we saw with the Ukraine resolutions a couple of months ago. The Secretary General has a moral authority that comes from the universality of the organization, and that can be useful when it comes to conflict mediation, post-conflict stabilization work, and indeed he could come to have a role in Ukraine at some point. We've seen that many times in the past. It's also the critical framework for global action on common goods, most notably climate. The COP process is based in the UN and is really only possible because of the UN framework. And heavens, we need a global health organization, and luckily we have the World Health Organization, which is far from ideal and can be greatly improved, but it is the universal health organization the planet needs. Other panelists are far more expert than I am in the international financial institutions, in organizations like the WTO. But I put in a plea at the outset of our discussion for the well-established international organizations. I think they do have a vital role to play, and they're sometimes overlooked. And among the alliances, NATO is both an alliance and an international organization, perhaps rather unusual in that. I worked in NATO both in the 1970s in the Cold War, and then as ambassador with Ambassador d'Abbeville in 2003, 4, 5, 6. And it is, I think it's a unique institution, really. It's unique in its longevity. Most alliances don't last 70, 80 years. I think that's essentially because it has a treaty which is based on values. People don't read Articles 1, 2, and 3, but they are threaded through with shared values. And it's based on political commitment. It's not based on large amounts of treaty text committing members to all kinds of obligations. It's based critically on confidence and political trust among allies that they will do what it says in the treaty, come to each other's aid if necessary. And that has allowed NATO to flex over the years. I think President Macron was always exaggerating when he talked about NATO being brain dead, but it certainly isn't brain dead now and is showing a kind of strategic purpose which we haven't seen for many years. And if we have Finland and Sweden join, I mean, that really is a strategic shift in the landscape. So that is an alliance and an organization that is founded on a treaty. It's very different from the EU, of course, and we don't need to go into the detail of the EU, but the EU is an organization that is based on endless text, legal text, constraining text, which gives it a rigidity, but also, no doubt, is necessary in the economic area. And just to make a point in passing, that Monnet and Schuman did have a go at using the tools of economic integration to apply to the defense world, with the European Defense Community, written in Paris, adopted by the 6 signatories of the Treaty of Rome, and then vetoed by the National Assembly in Paris in 1954, because the idea of surrendering sovereignty over something as critical to a nation state as the armed forces was impossible. So what these sort of organizations have as their strength is their continuity, is secretariats, is budgets, is capacity to deliver policies in the longer term. And so that's the first point. And then the distinction is between those and ad hoc alliances, of which there have always been many and are many today and will be in the future, which can be very useful. They can be groups of countries with a shared set of interests who join together to push that interest forward. When that interest begins to separate again, then they wither away. They tend not to have supporting secretariats and capacities to deliver, which is a problem. I mean, in my career, we've had many. I was thinking of the contact groups that were so important in the years of the Balkans Wars, which brought the Western allies and Russia together. They served their purpose, and they then fell apart. And I think we're seeing the process of alliance formation happening now in Asia. The previous panel was talking about the Asian Quad. I think it's a very interesting development. The Americans have tended to treat Asia as a forum for bilateral relationships, multiple bilateral relationships. The Quad is the first time, as far as I know, that the Americans have brought together, mutualized their bilateral relationships, treaties with Australia and Japan, and then have added India, which is, I think, the really interesting feature. India's never been comfortable about forming an alliance with Western countries, and it's still only 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the Asian alliance. Look at their lack of any sense of solidarity with Western countries over Ukraine, for example. So I think it's a very interesting development, and it rather bears out what is my proposition, that ad hoc alliances form when there are enough critical shared interests and are as strong as those interests last, and when they begin to fade, then the alliance gradually unravels and disappears. And AUKUS was mentioned in the last panel. That may be a rude word to use in the French école de guerre, but to my mind, AUKUS is not really an alliance. AUKUS is a military-industrial cooperation wrapped around with a very light veneer of partnership and alliance. I don't myself think that there is a critical mass of shared interest between Australia and the US, clearly are major Asian Indo-Pacific powers, and Britain, which is a secondary Indo-Pacific power, and we've just learned that Britain's primary security focus is Europe, and will continue to be Europe. So it may be that the alliance structure in Asia develops further. It may be that the Quad can, as the way it's being discussed, expand to include Britain and France in some aspects of it. It may be that AUKUS can somehow be broadened. But in any case, I don't think either Britain or France have their critical national security interests in the Indo-Pacific, so we'll always be secondary players. Other ideas, for example, a summit of democracies or a D10 of democratic countries, which were popular a couple of years ago, seem not to have yet found their maturity, and it may be that there isn't a distinctive overlapping of interest there to make them possible. They could have been potentially a replacement to the G20, and I know my colleague to my right will develop the themes of the economic alliances. The G20 seems to me to be fundamentally facing a problem now, given the antagonism of Russia and China towards Western countries, and it may be that that will have to evolve into a more Western-based organization for economic cooperation. All of these groups, the G groups and others, suffer from arbitrary membership, effectively, unrepresentative membership, chosen ad hoc, never satisfactory, and much time in alliance formation and contact group formation is spent on the plumbing of who could be a member, who are we going to exclude, which is largely a waste of time, because in the end, the countries with the clearest interests will coalesce into alliances. I am interested, just in passing, that we don't seem to have spawned a new alliance mechanism of any kind from the pandemic. I wondered at the beginning of the pandemic whether that would be the start for some new cooperation among like-minded countries. Of course, it exists in the scientific area with COVAX and so on, and vaccine research, but hasn't really spread into the geopolitical area as far as I'm aware. Given the scale of the impact of the pandemic on the world, that I find rather surprising. Just two more quick points. One of your questions, Sarah, was how alliances die or end. I mean, they fade away, mainly. When they're treaty-based, they're extremely difficult to kill. My own experience, and Ambassador d'Aberville, I think, shares it, was with the WEU, the Western European Union, treaty-based organization, senior to NATO, in the treaty was 1948, not 1949, fairly rapidly became surplus to requirements because the main requirement originally was to keep the German threat under control. It morphed away from that into an early organization for Western coordination. That too fell away really with NATO. It lingered on for decades, and it was only finally got rid of when we could wrap it into the European Union in the successive treaties. And of course, the ghost of the WEU survives in Article 42.7 of the EU treaties. So they are difficult to kill if they're treaty-based. If they're not, then they fade away when their work is done. My conclusion from that, that rather impressionist painting of an outline on alliances is that we need both the established organizations, the reason I've given, and ad hoc alliances, which develop as issues come to the fore and which serve as a useful source of action and encouragement and persuasion. I myself would like to see a new alliance form between the UK, France, and Germany on defense cooperation, given the new German interest and interesting financial commitment. I think that would be a valuable evolution from the enormously important Lancaster House cooperation between Britain and France, which has now fallen rather into it's fallen on hard times, shall I put it like that. It doesn't have the élan and the energy that it had. I would like to see that morph into a three-way cooperation in Europe, and also that we go on working on supporting the established international organizations, even when they're out of fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll move to our second speaker, Bertrand Badré, the former financial director of the World Bank. Obviously today we've had very heavy representation from the defence sector, whether it's military professionals or policymakers or academics like myself. So I'm very much looking forward to your interpretation of this issue.
Yes, I'm the biodiversity excuse today. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very honored to speak next to my two co-speakers. Effectively, I wondered why you invited me, because I have a limited military and security exposure, although not totally nil, because I've done my military service in the French Navy in the Pacific Ocean. So I've cruised all over the Pacific Ocean, which actually gave me a lot of credit when I joined the World Bank, because I was the only guy at the board who knew where Tonga was, where Vanuatu was, etc. So, and I also had another extraordinary experience, Mr. Ambassador, because I was part of Jacques Chirac diplomatic team by accident, but still, in the year 2003, which is famous for the war in Iraq. Absolutely. So I was under the leadership of both Michel Cantu, who was the former managing director of the IMF, who had asked me to work on, I would say, sustainable development, financing of development, etc. But I was housed by Maurice Gourdeau-Montagne, then Sherpa of Jacques Chirac. So I was really participating to all the conversation at that time. So that was quite interesting. So I'm not totally a virgin, but kind of. So back to the topic. Let me take a look back at history first. My focus is really on economic and financial matters, and because it's also connected to the sustainable development. We talk a lot about it. If we take a 50 years perspective, 1970, 1972, that's when the post-Second World War framework of Bretton Woods collapsed with a decision by Richard Nixon to move away from the convertibility of dollar into gold. So we moved from an organized system to a market-based system. That was a big shift, actually. We underestimated at that time. It was a temporary decision, actually, by the way. 50 years later, we're still in the temporary framework. It's also the moment where the famous economist Milton Friedman put as a principle that the social purpose of business was to make profit. So you had a market-based system, profit as a purpose, and that's basically what shaped the economy until now. I mean, that's really what became the neoliberal model, the Washington Consensus, and so on and so forth, and basically led to the so-called end of history in 1989. And that's really the consensus that was built among first the G7, interestingly. We come back to that later, when Giscard convened the G5 that became the G7, the Western countries really were willing to promote that model. So that's really what happened over the past 50 years. It worked kind of okay until it stopped working with the financial crisis and then the subsequent crisis since 2007, 2008, etc. But we are still in this model, and we are still, trying to move forward, but don't really know where to go. In parallel to that, it's very interesting because we had another set of coalitions that emerged. In 1972, the Club of Rome published its report on the limits to growth in a finite planet. And so it's interesting to see at the same time all the conversations were shaped. So in parallel to the conversation on financial integration, you had the conversation on sustainable development framed by the UN in 1988, the Brundtland report on sustainable development, then with the various COP, in particular the Kyoto one and then the others. The two sessions of the UN in 2000, the Millennium Development Goals, unanimity and consensus in 2000, and then in 2015 with the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the pins I have here. So you see that it's not an alliance. It's not even an organization. It's being shaped and framed by organization, the Bretton Woods Organization, the OECD and others. But it's kind of the Washington Consensus. I mean, it's being debated whether there was one or not, but the word in itself is interesting. There was a consensus. And to a certain extent, at the World Bank, you still have conditions if you want to get the money. It has changed over time. So it's a system, whether we like it or not. It's a system, even if it's being challenged. So all these things have kind of converged. I'm trying to be a little fast in 2015. And that's probably the climax of multilateralism. 2015, we had 3 big sessions. One in Addis Ababa, not that well known, on partnering for development. One in New York on the occasion of the UN Assembly in September, the adoption of Sustainable Development Goals by everybody, including the US. Actually, they never moved away from that. And then the Paris Accord in December. So in 2015, it was basically the most emblematic aspect was the handshake between Barack Obama and Xi Jinping. We all saw that this was the after financial crisis roadmap agreed by everybody on Earth. And that was basically the climax, I would say, of the Fukuyama vision of the world. We had agreed on a collective and universal framework of sustainability, resilience, and inclusiveness. That was really a great idea. And of course, it didn't work this way, as we very well know. Then COVID hit. We realized that we are totally off track on most of the objectives agreed 5 years before. It's true on climate, it's true on biodiversity, it's true on nature, it's true on gender. You take them one by one, we're off track on all the list. And there are many reasons for that, in particular because we have not been able to reframe, to change the operating system. There's a system which is totally market-based and driven by profit will not naturally adjust to what we have agreed to. And that's where the tension starts. Second point, there is no master of the world, actually, because we move from a kind of, as Védrine said, the hyperpower. So it lasted a few years. But now there is a competition between the system, between the ideological system, economic and financial system. And so to design what is sustainable today is not that easy. To design what is, when you discuss diversity and inclusion, I can tell you, if you ask an American, a Chinese, or French, they will give different versions of diversity and inclusion, and so on and so forth. You can take them one by one. So there is no master of the world. But more importantly, there is a competition around these issues, because it's real about what is the economy we want to have, and how do we want to finance this economy. And there are a lot of vested interests behind this. Who is going to design the system? Who is going to sell? I mean, the pipes, all the things that make the system work. And it's precisely at a moment where we need this for the planet, I don't say the globalization, planetarization in a way, that the globalization is dislocating, that all the attributes of the post-Second World War, I mean, the World Bank, I've been managing director of the World Bank, but the IMF and all the things are starting to be under pressure. And more importantly, the G world that you alluded to is at risk. I mean, the G20 was basically the miraculous baby of the financial crisis. It existed before at the ministerial level. It became a G20 of heads of state. I doubt that this year will be a success. I mean, I don't see any circumstances under which Putin, Biden, whoever is elected in France, etc., will gather, take a family picture and say, yes, it is okay. Can you imagine the COP27 in Egypt, where Egypt is going to starve, where you don't know whether China and Russia will participate, etc. So there is something broken in the system. And on top of that, and that's my allusion to the G7, it's kind of a circular. We are back to a G7 world. I represented the World Bank at the G7 discussion, and I remember when we had the first G7 meeting after Russia was expelled from the G8, I remember my German and my British colleagues say, oh, finally we can speak, no Chinese, no Russian in the room. So we are back to the family business, so the Western world. But the problem is that when we started the G7 in 1975, it was 60% of the global economy. Now we are 40%. And at that time, I don't know whether we had friends or not, but we were kind of accepted as a de facto leader of the world. Today, people don't like us. Look at the maps of the votes around Ukraine. I mean, all the France have abstained at best, if not voted against. And so that's really where we are today. So we are back to a G7 world, but with a totally different environment. And so my final point is, in that context, how do we move forward? How can we be truly inclusive? What does this alliance mean? Is it a defensive alliance where we try to protect our garden, like a bad Voltaire way, we have to cultivate our garden? Or are we trying to offer a new hand to this country which have showed defiance to us? Let me share a brief fable, a parable. It has nothing to do, but I was so excited to mention flowers in the context of the École de Guerre. You know or you don't know that 92% of flowers sold in Europe or US don't come from US or Europe, and don't come even from the Netherlands, as most people know. They come from Kenya and Ecuador. And that's interesting. And so today, I'm an investor. I have the possibility to invest in flowers in Ecuador. And so it's a great company. They pay their guys well. They don't waste water. They don't waste fertilizer. So it's a great company. But seen from Europe today, the idea to bring flowers into a plane, to bring them to Europe, rings a bell. What about the CO2 emission? Blah, blah, blah. So it's bad. So do you tell to Ecuador and Kenya, you push them to do that 30 years ago and say, oh, no, the Parisian bobo or the Washington hipster is not at ease. So guys, game over. You keep your flowers. No wonder why these people are not happy at you and vote against you when you are asked to vote for you. So my point is that we really have to change this vision. We can't behave as just a loose coalition of people around the Washington consensus. It's not going to work. So we have to really find a way that whatever we call it, an alliance or a partnership or a coalition, or I don't know the name, but it's truly inclusive. I think this is really, my flowers in a way have become geopolitical emblem. And we have to reinvent multilateralism. And it's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult because we are not reinventing. We are building competing organizations. I remember when I was managing director of the World Bank, China created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And I was on record and I say, I like competition. It's great because at least with AIIB, the World Bank will be forced to move. It didn't work. The World Bank did not move and the Chinese moved. And now we have two banks. And that's just the beginning. So just to conclude, I think we are at a tipping point. As you rightly say, NATO and the EU have found a new momentum, which is both positive, but also not so positive. Because if they gain a momentum by being defensive and protective, and yes, we are defending the true church of Western civilization, I don't think it will last that long. So that's where we are. I think we are at a very interesting moment in time. Sorry, it was not about security, but I was happy to bring flowers to the table.
Very good.
Thank you for that. So to bring this out the presentations to a close, we'll go to our final speaker of the panel. We're going over to Bruno Tetre, and he is a strategist and the FRS co-director. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I need to begin with an apology. I'll have to leave at 6 p.m. sharp because my own organization is organizing its own conference. This was not scheduled, so apologies for that, Madam Chairwoman. I think it's great that Bertrand brought the flowers to the table because it may, for several reasons. First is because alliances are not only military alliances, indeed, and also because your conclusion reminds me that there is something like a reconstructed West, which is a little bit of G7, a little bit of NATO. The mere fact that Japan and Australia, I think, were present as special guests in the latest NATO meeting does say something about that. And it does make us indeed think about what the nature of alliances are. Sometimes when I hear the reminder, the very accurate reminder by distinguished speakers like Peter, that NATO is supposed to be founded on both interests and values, there's one country that comes to mind, which is Turkey. There's a question mark on how much, in the long run, Europe and North America will continue to have both common interests and common values with Turkey. But maybe it's a question for the future. It's a question for the past, a question for the future, but it's not a question for the present, because Turkey, as far as I understand, actually has been a very steady ally in the last week. Now, I'm going to steer the conversation back to military alliances, indeed, but to go back to a point made by Peter, I think it is important to distinguish between several kinds of military alliances. Certainly those who are, most of them are treaty-based, but I like to think that a real military alliance, a defense alliance, is one which involves a defense commitment. Most of the time, these defense commitments are treaty-based. Not all the time. The US-Taiwan alliance, for instance, I like to call it an alliance because the layers upon layers of defense cooperation, to which are added very strong unilateral statements, such as the one by President Biden, who last year actually put Taiwan in the same category as other treaty-based alliances. That's, for all intents and purposes, does create, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as the Chinese are concerned, I believe, some kind of defense commitment. Now, one of the first articles that I wrote, journals articles that I wrote when I became a free person, that was in 2004, I wrote a piece that, to my dismay today, said something along the lines like, permanent multinational alliances increasingly appear to be a thing of the past. How wrong was I? So I'm happy to say that I was entirely wrong. And in fact, what I think today is that alliances, the network of contemporary military alliances is actually strong as it has ever been. In fact, I think I was so wrong in 2004 that I can say that standing military alliances are proliferating, are widening, and are deepening. And to these alliances are added an additional layer of security cooperation, such as, the Quad is not an alliance because it's not even supposed to talk about defense. Maybe it will become some kind of security. Well, okay, they discuss maritime security, but not defense, because India does not want to discuss defense. But clearly, it's part of the ecosystem, as they say today. It's ecosystem, biodiversity. It's another biodiversity thing. So I think the result is a network of interlocking defense relationship to which an ever thicker layer of new security groupings and what one could call quasi-alliances. Any IR professor here, don't blame me. I'm not an IR theorist, so I don't even know whether quasi-alliance means a thing in IR. So most of the old alliances, those pre-1990 alliances have proven resilient. Very few have disappeared, except for the Warsaw Pact, of course, and a couple of French alliances and French defense commitments in Africa, which no longer exist. But most of them have been deepening and expanding. The new ones, I don't need to make the list. So you have this expanding network of alliances and quasi-alliances. And the big question is, does this create more stability or more instability? Does alliance proliferation increase or decrease the risk of war? And moreover, if deterrence failed and war erupted somewhere with countries that are supposed to be covered by defense commitments, what would be the risk of horizontal escalation? Should we fear a new kind of 1914-like chain of events, as some commentators and experts fear? And of course, no definitive answer can ever be given in those topics, but I believe that evidence suggests that the current proliferation of alliances is on balance more stabilizing to world order than destabilizing. If you want a detailed answer, it happens that I have a monograph published by the Atlantic Council of the United States. They keep postponing it because, Ukraine. So I've announced it on Twitter like 2 or 3 times. Oh, next week? No. But it should be published in late April. That's just to let you know that even though my arguments may appear crude, I try to make them much more detailed and supported by evidence and sources in that piece. There are well-known risks that I put I don't really have an IR hat, but I'm going to pretend for 2 minutes that I'm an IR theorist. Now the entrapment question, being trapped by your ally or your protector. I believe that today the 2 arguments that are made to support the risk of entrapment, the risk of emboldening and the risk for reputation of the protector, I think that overall they tend to be overblown today. Again, I apologize if I don't make these arguments in details today, but I'm aware of the arguments, and I try to make the case in this piece that the risks of entrapment are much lower than the probability of this whole network to be stabilizing and a force for peace. By the way, the network today, just one argument for those who talk about a possible chain of events 1914-like. To begin with, I think the latest scholarship, the real scholarship, I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic. I have all the, how do you say, sacrament?
Well, sacraments.
Well, I have the sacraments, but I'm not practice. I don't preach. I have the sacraments.
Taken the sacraments.
Yeah, I've taken sacraments, but I don't practice. The latest scholarship in 1914 makes one much more prudent than was the case 20 or 30 years ago about this idea of the network of alliances being in itself. Well, thank you for approving. Please, if you have arguments to the contrary, do let us know. But that's what I understand, at least from the latest scholarship on 1914. And also, the network of alliances today is very different from what it was a century ago. Russia has 5 former allies. China has 1 former ally, just one. India has 0. And the United States has about, 5? Feel free to challenge my arguments, but in terms of formal defense commitments, that's what I see on paper, at least. And the US has about 5 dozen. So it's a very unbalanced system, or at least it's not a symmetrical system, it's an asymmetrical question. But still, there are questions, of course, about how this system will operate in wartime. We know that the more alliances there are, the more the chances of at least one of them to be tested is real. NATO, the Article 5 of NATO may be tested one way or the other in the coming weeks, days, hours, who knows. I still believe that President Putin has been overall very cautious about Article 5. There was a weird comment in his press conference with Macron in January. At some point, he does mention, and I've checked the translation, Article 5 of the Rome Treaty. Okay? So you don't know whether he refers to the EU, to NATO, and whether the confusion is deliberate or not deliberate. I leave it to Russian scholars to let us know whether it was deliberate or not.
The NATO-Russia summit treaty.
Oh, the NATO
2002.
Rome? Was it in Rome? Oh, thank you. Oh, I had missed that hypothesis. 3 hypotheses. It's a feast for political scientists today. But overall, obviously, the probability that Article 5 is being tested one way or the other in the coming days, weeks, hours, is certainly higher than it was a year ago. There will be also complex cases. What happens to Finland and Sweden before they get formally protected by Article 5? What happens if there ever was another serious incident between Turkey and Greece? There is 42.7, indeed. There is also an additional layer, which is the French defense commitment to Greece. And my conclusion, Madam Chairwoman, is very simple, is that I'm always intrigued and disappointed by the reluctance of political leaders and their immediate subordinates to not wargame, but think about these scenarios. I don't know how true it is in the UK, Peter, but in France, the paucity of brainstorming crisis exercises of that kind is really very, very, very poor. I believe the UK is doing better overall, but the grass is always greener, blah, 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 blah. And certainly, these are issues that you do want your political leaders to think about, not to give you, the armed forces and the ministry and government officials, the directions on where they would go, because you can't. But at least to train the intellectual muscles in order to not be completely surprised the day we have a real test of a defense commitment. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's been a really good way to, finish our panel. And I think the reason that I smiled so much when you mentioned the new approach in history then is because I feel that it's almost a similar approach that we've taken here today. We've not just spoken about military strategy or military possibilities, but we've situated that within a broader conversation about the world, the economy, and all these other constraints that we sometimes leave out of the conversation, but ultimately do shape the military responses that we take. And I think it's been one of the key things from today has been a real reminder that nothing we do is in isolation. This is a global picture. We're all signed up to various alliances, various treaties. Some of those are easy to just kind of let die out. Some are not so much. Some will inform the national decisions that we take or the decisions that we make in alliances. And I think we've all been left with possibly a lot more questions about alliances at the end, but I think it's good to walk away with some questions there about the possibilities, the constraints, as I mentioned, and what will happen in the future, which I guess is down to our politicians. So good luck to both of our countries with that one. So we'll wrap up the sessions for today here, and I'll hand over to my colleague, Mr. Paul O'Neill, who will give us our concluding remarks. So if we could just give a last round of applause to the panel.